I call the member for Bowman.
Well, Deputy Chair, it's encouraging to hear the response from the opposition to support, in the main, all of these schedules that we're discussing tonight. So it leaves me very little to do apart from echo the overview of the bill that the opposition spokesman did so well, to say that these are very, very important measures that are very strongly supported by the Australian public. Of course, many of the finer details of the Migration Act are not well understood by the man and woman on the street. So it's important in these examples where, in many cases, law has been tested and taken to the highest court, that where the policy intent has not been followed, it's only appropriate that we should be making clarifications today. Obviously, there are huge and seismic changes in immigration policy, but this piece of legislation is an example of where we'll be making the everyday today operations for those people that are both seeking visas or seeking adjudication on their eligibility for visas to be done in a more streamlined way and in a way that concurs with the original intent of the legislation. So to very briefly touch on those points again, the first section making very clear, the first schedule, that the individuals that have been previously refused a visa should not have the act of consideration of a subsequent visa refused unless that refusal has occurred since their most recent arrival in Australia. And so in simple points, this means that if you were refused a visa in the distant past on a previous trip to Australia, that is not any prevention for you returning to this country on a different visa, being accepted and being able to stay. And that's, I think, an important clarification. The second schedule, which I think is also of enormous public interest, is the clash between sections 195 and 198 brackets 5 in the Act. And this is about ensuring the correct operation of removals policy intent. And I guess on every street corner there are stories about people who are applying to come to Australia, arrive, are refused, go through to the highest courts, exhaust all their options for approval and for review, only then being able to thwart the system by applying for a second bridging visa or a subsequent bridging visa, finding opportunities within the very generous legal system that we have available to them, ways of frustrating or preventing their return. And so this removes that ambiguity and puts beyond doubt that if a person has applied for a protection visa and that visa has not yet been refused, or they're still under the reviews and appeals process, they cannot be removed. But once that process has been completed, they cannot make spurious claims to new bridging visas in an effort to continue their stay. Look, in Section 3, the recovery of costs was very controversial. And in 2009, it seemed like from the government of the day, such a compassionate thing to do to remove what were sometimes enormous costs from individuals who are often innocent parties in the process. But we know that that is, in the main, not the case. It was then that those amendments removed the liability for people and liable third parties to reimburse the Commonwealth for the costs of transporting them while they're in immigration detention. And I'm glad that the opposition spokesman made it very, very clear that this does not apply to asylum seekers. This would have been a very, very tempting piece of misinformation to promote around the nation, but it absolutely is not the case. And this predominantly applies to convicted people smugglers or to illegal foreign fishers who are detained under particular elements of the Act. Now, the specific concern that's being addressed today, the loophole that's being closed, is that there were some provisions that actually impeded the recovery of those debts. And the examples that have already been tested in court, those who were not initially detained because of Section 250, but they may well have been detained under other sections, which made it actually impossible to reclaim those debts. They may well have been granted some other form of visa, and an example of this is your criminal justice day visa, where it's in the public interest to complete a court process and potential prosecution of an individual. But in that case, and many instances where that occurred, the individual on that visa was also able to escape reasonable cost recovery. And lastly, of course, where they're not in immigration detention at the time of their conviction, which was a massive loophole, given that now around 27,000 of the 30,000 in Australia are not in detention. also making large numbers of people immune from debt recovery. And the overall concern there was a simple one, that it was removing that disincentive, removing that very, very clear signal to these persons who are participating in people smuggling and in illegal foreign fishing, that there will be significant costs if they are caught, and if the costs of that detention and transportation will accrue to them. Look, on authorised recipients, this is Schedule 4. This is a fairly complex area where someone who's authorised to receive written documentation, written communication from the government, it's now very, very clear what those individuals' obligations are to government and vice versa. So there's no obligation on the government to share with them oral communication, because their role is specifically restricted to documentation, but also that these authorised individuals can't move into other forms of activity on behalf of their client beyond receipt of documents. And obviously these authorised recipients need to get the individual's consent if they wish to cease to be an authorised individual. They can't simply refuse to do so or withdraw that consent without the individual knowing. And then lastly, Crimes Act's specific information that's collected under the Crimes Act with search warrants would seem utterly reasonable to the Australian public that should be germane to administrative decisions under the Citizenship Act. And Australians would like to know that all possible evidence that has been legally collated should be available to a minister or a department in making those citizenship decisions. So, relatively small issues. These are issues that have gone to, in many cases, Deputy Speaker, the highest court in the land. As a result of these decisions, some of the more ambiguous elements of this legislation are corrected tonight, and it's good to see that there's bipartisan support to ensure that indeed occurs.